So recently, I came across r/anime suggest, where people are trying to find recommendations for extremely specific topics, like, for example, what you're seeing on screen right now. And if there's anything I want to be known for, it's for being able to give good manga recommendations. So I thought I would flex my manga recommendation skills and give recommendations for 25 of these Reddit threads. My name is Anish, and welcome to Manga Niche. If I help you find something new to read, then please consider subscribing. But if I don't, then I don't know, just yell at me in the comments to do better. A thriller story with a protagonist who's hiding a troubling secret from others. As soon as I saw this topic, one suggestion immediately came to mind for me, and that suggestion is Until Your Bones Rot. My first time seeing Until Your Bones Rot is actually through this meme I saw on Reddit, and while this meme doesn't actually happen in this story, the skeleton that you see in the picture is definitely relevant. Until Your Bones Rot is an incredibly thrilling and suspenseful story about a group of kids who, 5 years before the story even starts, got together and they killed a man. Now, who this man is and why they killed him is part of the mystery, but every year for 5 years straight, they've been revisiting the body that they buried in the middle of the woods. But on the 5th year, something changed, because instead of the body, they just find a cell phone where the body's supposed to be, and as soon as they find it, it starts ringing. And the caller on the other end is someone who knows their secret and is threatening to reveal it unless they do what he says. And right from chapter 1, the story just keeps amping up the suspense and the thrills constantly. Because not only is this suspicious man on the phone someone the kids have to deal with, they also have this genius detective hot on their trails trying to figure out who the killers are. And on top of that, the group of kids are extremely dysfunctional. They all have their own motives for doing what they're doing, and all have different ways of coping with the possibilities of their secret being revealed. There's a lot of really messed up psychological aspects to the story, and I highly recommend it. A manga where the MC is the antagonist. See, this particular topic is something that's really interesting to me because so many stories kinda get it wrong. I think when it comes to this topic, a lot of people are looking for something like Death Note, where it's someone who has their own particular sense of justice, but are executing it in a way that's pretty messed up to other people. But at the end of the day, they see themselves as the hero, even if others don't. And where a lot of stories kind of go wrong with this is they make it really edgy, really over the top. They think that being violent and gory and the MC not having much remorse over it is the perfect way to show that he's this badass evil person. But I think a story that gets it right is Talentless Nana. Talentless Nana starts us off with a setting where we find ourselves at a high school that's in the middle of an ocean. We're told that the students of this high school are actually being trained to become the next generation of heroes, as they all possess powers called talents that can be used to fight a supernatural monster threat that are simply just called the enemies of humanity. Well, one day, a transfer student named Nana joins the school, and she immediately befriends one of the kids who's really picked on and bullied in the class. After a few days of spending time together, they go out on a walk, and Nana pushes him off a cliff and kills him. It's revealed by the end of chapter 1 that the government has actually set up this high school to contain all of the enemies of humanity. All of the kids with talents are the enemies, and it's Nana's job, who's hired by the government, to kill all of these kids. There is a reason why the government went about this route, but it's a spoiler, so I'm not going to reveal it. But I think the story does a really good job in a couple different ways. First off, as the title implies, Nana is talentless. She's just a normal person. So it's kind of always interesting to see the way that she outwits all of these kids to overcome the difference in powers and still kill them off. The other part that she does really well is that she knows exactly what she's doing. A lot of the story kind of revolves around her internal conflict on, are these kids actually worth killing? Are they actually evil? Couldn't their powers actually be used to help humanity? That moral conflict helps drive the story forward, and I think it does so in a pretty good way. The main character is exiled or betrayed and revenge. As soon as I saw this prompt, I knew that there was only one manga I could suggest, and that manga is Übel Blatt, which happened to have a main character who was kind of both exiled and betrayed. And man, it's actually kind of randomly a really good time to get into Übel Blatt, because this manga came out over 20 years ago, but all of a sudden, there's a new anime that's coming out for it, and an Übel Blatt 2 just started releasing. So if you're going to get into this story, definitely get on it now. In the setting of Übel Blatt, 20 years before the story starts, we're told that there's two warring nations. One is a country of humans and one is a country of demons. In order to protect the humans from the threat of the demons, the king of the humans sent out 14 of his greatest warriors to the border between the two nations to erect a barrier that would keep the country safe. However, along the way, the mission of those 14 heroes has become something of a legend in the world. 3 of those heroes died along the way, 4 of them betrayed the team, and the remaining 7 lived on to become the heroes that erected the barrier. And now, fast forwarding 20 years later, we start the story from the perspective of this twink, who honestly looks pretty unimposing. But to the surprise of everyone, this kid is actually able to take on hundreds of soldiers all at once through the use of his amazing sword skills and the use of his really cool secret weapons. We find out that this kid was actually the leader of the 4 who betrayed those 14 heroes and was somehow able to survive for 20 years straight by eating on the remains of a fairy and gaining its magic powers. But the twist here is that the legend is actually backwards. The 4 betrayers were actually the 4 heroes who went to the border to erect the barrier, and the 7 heroes of legend were too scared to join them. But on the way back from erecting the barrier, the 7 killed the other 4 and stole their glory. And now, our main character, Koenzel, is off on a mission to kill the other 7. But what makes the story really interesting is that, in a sense, this world is almost like Frieren. The Demon King, aka the Barrier, has been completed, and now the kingdom is in kind of a state of peace, or at least that's how it looks. And now, as Koenzel is off on his mission to kill these 7 heroes, who've already in their own ways started to create this post-war kind of area for themselves, Koenzel has to come to terms with whether his revenge is even worth killing these heroes, and possibly destabilizing the peace across the nation. A modern tournament manga. Yes, I've been waiting for a chance to talk about this because I think Tenkaichi is extremely under the radar and has one of the most unique storytelling concepts that I've ever seen. And what makes this so unique is that there's no main character and the authors don't know how it's going to end. They're literally winging this as they go. So in a way, they're kind of replicating the actual experience of watching a tournament in real life in this manga. So what is Tenkaichi about? This manga is set in the year 1600 towards the end of Oda Nobunaga's reign. In this fictional version of history, Oda has decided that his successor will be determined through a tournament of the 16 most legendary fighters of the era. And these fighters were definitely altered by the writers to be really cool and really badass. I mean, just see how cool the first match of the tournament looks. Now let me explain to you a little bit more about how this concept works. Like I was saying before, there's no single main character. For every single match that happens, the authors go into it not knowing who's going to win. It's only in the final few chapters of a fight that the author and his team get together to vote on who's going to win. But up until that point, there is no plot armor, and the idea that there's no plot armor for any of these characters really makes you on the edge of your seat and just be like, wow, holy shit, this is really cool. A manga where characters can rewind time like in ReZero. Yeah, so I think these kinds of time reversal stories have been really popular lately, just looking at, obviously, ReZero, then Summertime Rendering, and even Tokyo Revengers. But I think one that's flown under the radar is called Psyche's Repeated Days. This story starts off pretty tragically, as the childhood friend of our main character Psyche is sadly killed in a car accident. But while Psyche's grieving over the loss of his best friend, he accidentally falls into a nearby lake and drowns. But to his surprise, he wakes up on the morning before the accident. We find out that when he dies in this specific lake, he's able to rewind time back to that same morning. So every day is basically like a new save point. And what makes Psyche's Repeated Days so interesting is how willing Psyche is to just make use of his power whenever he needs to. Like, for example, in one of the fights he gets into, he literally repeated himself, aka ran to the lake and drowned himself 200 times in a row, just to completely learn how the fight will exactly play out so he can find the moment to counterattack and win. But as you might be able to guess, there is a trade-off for literally dying hundreds of times nonstop. And that trade-off makes Psyche's Repeated Days a little more intense than you might think at first. Story where the main character isn't a wimp. Alright, so for this one, I thought I'd give you guys a really fun one. This is a story that really only works because of how not a wimp the main character is. I mean, he's pretty much the epitome of this video.
Whoa. I was just gonna say it. This guy fucks, am I right?
The story starts off at a certain high school in Japan, where there's a power struggle brewing between the top martial artists in the school. The chief director of the school had decided to seek out the help of an Aikido master to help his granddaughter win the power struggle. And that master is our main character Jokyu, who was actually so strong that it scared his father to do something drastic to him. His father drugged Jokyu and put him to sleep, and while he was asleep, joint by joint dislocated and relocated every single part of his body, and in doing so, sealed off 70% of his power. But even with only the remaining 30%, Jokyu is a complete badass. And while the story keeps throwing harder and harder opponents at him, Jokyu slowly gets his power back and eventually starts to face off against people who are complete masters. The story is really fun, really entertaining, and actually has a pretty memorable set of characters. A reverse isekai. You know, with so many isekai out there, I feel like there should be way more reverse isekai out there. And I know that most isekai typically have the reputation that they're not especially well written, but this one is written by the same author as Fullmetal Alchemist, and I think it's a complete banger. This manga is Daemons of the Shadow Realm, and I know that the title kind of sounds whatever and doesn't really sound anything special, and believe me, most people agree with it as well and kind of hate the name, but this manga is so good. This manga starts off with the main character in this kind of like feudal era Japan kind of vibe, and he's just off on a day hunting, but as he gets back to his village, he decides to go visit his sister, who is in kind of solitary confinement in his jail. And while he's visiting her, we find out that only him and a few other people in this village are allowed to talk to her. And while he's talking to his sister, they suddenly hear loud sounds outside. He thinks that it might be dragons passing by, so he goes outside to look. And as he goes outside to look, he sees helicopters everywhere with Gatling guns shooting down the villagers. He doesn't know what the heck these things are, and tries his best to protect his sister. And we find out that this village has actually been hidden through magic for hundreds of years in the middle of the Japanese mountains. But the reason that the outside world has suddenly intervened on this village that has been isolated for hundreds of years is specifically because of the main character and his twin sister, who are two twins who are destined to kind of bring greatness or ruin to the world. They're two people that so many people want access to and are there to abduct him. And just like the twins, the key thing to know about this story is that most things happen in pairs. The daemons of this title refer to the monsters that most of the supernatural people in this world have access to. These daemons are always split into two monsters that have completely opposite powers and personalities. For example, one person's daemons might be a tortoise and a hare with speed or heavy kind of powers, or another example might be a daemon that's an upper and lower jaw that's able to eat anything. And this story just keeps amping up the more and more you read it. There's so much mystery and there's so many sides to this. Just when you think you know what one side's up to and who's good and who's bad, everything kind of changes on its head and then changes again. This story is constantly evolving, and I think that we're still in the early phases of this manga. But by the time this manga finishes, and maybe, who knows, the next 10 years or something, I think Daemons of the Shadow Realm will be a household name just like Full Metal Alchemist. Manga that you can binge in one night. Alright, the recommendation I have for you is My Balls. And My Balls is definitely something that is memorable, to say the least. This manga is definitely R-rated, so you have to be okay with that. This story starts off with a fight between angels and the Queen of Demons. The angels are trying to seal the Demon Queen, but accidentally seal her inside of the balls of some random dude who happened to be walking by. And now the fear is that if he ever gets off, the Demon Queen will be released and threaten to destroy the world. Now, demons across the underworld are on a mission to get this man to get off. And yeah, that's really the story. I think it was really funny, really entertaining, definitely something that you can read in one night. And yeah, don't tell your mom about this one. A manga with a cyberpunk setting. You know, you'd think there'd be more cyberpunk stories with how cool they are, but they're actually a little bit rare. But one that I found that I think is great is Dimension W. Dimension W takes place in a future where humanity has somehow been able to find another dimension called Dimension W, where they're able to tap into it to unlock unlimited power. And in doing so, they've basically solved the world's electricity problems. All electricity is able to be generated through use of this dimension. And in order to access this dimension, one company has created a technology called coils, which is able to connect to Dimension W. But because unlimited power can probably be dangerous, this company has decided to put on a limiter on all technology that uses coils. Our main character works as a bounty hunter to track down any illegal coils that have removed their limiters. His job is to find these coils and turn them in for a bounty, but it's usually criminals who are using these illegal coils in the first place, so a lot of his job comes down to being able to outfight his enemies. But in this world filled with technology, our main character is someone who absolutely hates technology. He's one of the only few that is still driving a gasoline car. I know, crazy. But on a night that seemed like a normal retrieval mission, he suddenly encounters a robot that seems completely sentient. And the sentience of this robot has him calling into question everything he knows about AI and technology. The mysteries surrounding this robot uncover a lot of different conspiracies that take place all at once, but the mysteries of Dimension W really remind me of something like Fire Force, where on one hand it feels like the actual world itself is mysterious, but there's also a lot of really sketchy underlying forces that are acting in the background that are also adding additional layers of mystery and suspense to the story. A manga about a body switch. Okay, I get it. The movie Freaky Friday was kind of a banger, so now you want a manga about body switching. And I think Dungeon and Chameleon is probably the best body switch manga I've ever read. And this was a complete sleeper hit for me. I kind of expected nothing going into reading this, but honestly, this is probably one of my favorites from the whole video. This is a manga about making manga, kind of similar to Bakuman, but I wholeheartedly believe that Dungeon and Chameleon will surpass Bakuman in popularity at some point in the future. Now, I think one of the important factors of being able to tell a story about making manga is that the author themselves should have a pretty knowledgeable grasp of the industry. And by Bakuman, it was made by the duo that made Death Note and a few others, so they obviously had a ton of amazing experience in order to write Bakuman. But the author of Dungeon and Chameleon has kind of similar levels of experience. While he hasn't seemed to make any manga himself that have become extremely popular, he has worked with Oda as an assistant on One Piece, so I think he definitely has perspective of what it's like to be at the top of the Shonen Jump world. Honestly, speaking of Oda, I kind of feel like the main character of Dragon and Chameleon was modeled after Oda in a few ways, or probably more likely modeled after Toriyama. In this story, the Dragon and the Chameleon are nicknames for two different people. The Dragon of this world is someone who's kind of considered to be the GOAT of manga. He's created a manga called Dragonland that has become the #1 best-selling manga of all time. Meanwhile, the Chameleon is one of the assistants on Dragonland, who is famed for his ability to copy any art style flawlessly. But after a freak accident involving the two, they end up switching bodies. But the Chameleon makes use of this opportunity to flawlessly copy Dragonland and become the new owner himself. But meanwhile, our main character, the Dragon, is stuck in this younger person's body and has to climb his way from the bottom up once again to surpass the GOAT manga that he created before. So I think the story kind of combines a few different elements. On one hand, it does have that body switch feature to it, but it also kind of has this interesting kind of power fantasy to it, where the main character is obviously pretty OP when it comes to manga skills, and constantly completely surprises everyone with how good he is, especially because people don't know who he actually is. Plus, the story features my new mommy, so you know it's gotta be good. But the Chameleon isn't the only rival around, and there's always a new generation of talents that our main character, the Dragon, will have to deal with. A manga about a magic school. You know, I think there's a lot of these manga out there, like Marshall and M0, where it's about a magic school, but the main character is someone who can't actually use magic. And you know, I thought I would add one more into that bunch too. And so the recommendation that I have for you for a magic school category is Wistoria. This is actually by the same author as Is It Wrong to Pick Up Girls in the Dungeon? And it does actually feature some similar elements, like for example, the existence of a dungeon. But overall, the setting's pretty different. The story takes place at pretty much the Hogwarts of this world, but like I was saying, the main character can't use magic. In order to graduate from this school, students need to accumulate points in 3 different categories. They need to have good academics and test scores, they need to do well on practical exams of magic, and 3, they need to rack up points by killing monsters in a dungeon. But our main character is a complete badass with a sword and is determined to accumulate all of his points from killing monsters in a dungeon with his sword skills. Wistoria is a really entertaining manga and I think is pretty well written, and the art is absolutely gorgeous. One important note here is that the dungeon can be considered a tower, kind of similar to Tower of God, where there's different levels, and once you go up it, you'll be able to reach the sky. And because of that, there's actually a little bit of a romance subtone to it, with the main character trying to climb this tower so that he can meet his childhood friend who he has a crush on. But only the 5 strongest mages in the world live at the top of the tower, so he has to prove that he's able to become one of them. And his first step to this is graduating from this school so that he'll be given the authorization to climb this tower. I think Wistoria is awesome, and I think the anime adaptation is coming out later this summer, so be sure to keep your eye on it. A story with an assassin that actually kills people. Alright, the story that I have for you is Dendrobates, which really features the John Wick of manga. This manga is super straightforward, but if what you want is a hitman kind of assassin guy who goes off and kills people, that's what this story is. Every chapter is just fight after fight of the main character just going around being a hitman and killing people. And the reason the main character of the story is such a good assassin is that while he's working as an assassin at night, during the day, he's actually an accountant for the police department. And as an accountant for the police department, he's in a position where he can access the weapon inventory that the police has while also being completely under the radar. And so he's picked up the reputation as the man with 1,000 guns because he has so many options that he brings out on every single mission he goes on. And yeah, like I was saying, this manga is really straightforward, just a lot of fast-paced action. So if you're into that, check Dendrobates out. An action story that features a dynamic duo as the main characters. Okay, this one's an oldie but a goldie, and is honestly something that I think a lot of people have forgotten about over time. And that story is Get Backers. And yeah, this story follows 2 people who together make up a freelance company called the Get Backers. Their mission is that they'll try and retrieve any lost or stolen item for any client. And the 2 characters themselves are actually pretty cool. One of them is more of the upbeat funny guy who's able to control electricity, whereas the other one is definitely the more serious and stereotypically cool character who has an insanely strong 200 kilogram grip and also what he calls the evil eye, which is able to create illusions in enemies. And the story starts off with these 2 characters clearly having already been through a lot together. And because of that, it feels like there's already this great organic relationship between them. But they're obviously different people, and the story does a great job at putting them through these moral dilemmas that really test the limit of their friendship and teamwork. And while this starts off as kind of a funny story of them just going through all of these different retrieval missions, the story really picks up and gets really fast-paced, really actiony, with lots of world building. This is a manga that has spanned over 300 chapters in a weekly shonen setting, and I think has definitely stood the test of time. A wholesome, feel-good romance story. Okay, so you want a wholesome feel-good romance story? Well, how about Molester Man, featuring main character Molester Man and other characters like Lollyjugs. Alright, I know that it sounds kind of goofy from just the name and also kind of weird, but this is actually a really wholesome, really amazing story that's only 21 chapters long. So something that you can read pretty quickly, but in that short time will probably leave a really big impression on you. So the backstory of this manga is that apparently this is actually the true story of someone who posted on 2chan some 20 years ago. And it follows the story of a 20-year-old, really socially inept, awkward kid develops a crush for someone who is totally out of his league, and through a series of misunderstandings develops the name Molester Man, but most of the characters in the story don't actually have a name and have some kind of weird nickname to them. And this manga really does a great job at making everything just feel so organic and brought to life. It does a great job at tackling topics like being socially awkward, falling in love, dealing with trauma, and things like that. Favorite non-mainstream isekai? Yeah, so there's obviously a lot of isekai out these days, but the one that I wanted to bring up is actually something I read probably over a decade ago, but has stuck with me ever since. And that manga is One Half Prince. One Half Prince I always thought was pretty interesting. It's an isekai where the main character goes into a video game, but the twist here is that it's actually a gender bender. The main character is a girl in real life, but in the video game, she plays as a man. I used to be big into MMOs, and so the concept of someone switching up their gender inside of a video game was pretty normal to me, and I'm kind of surprised that more stories don't incorporate it. And I thought One Half Prince did a pretty good job with this concept because it actually utilized the gender bender point as part of the plot. As the main character meets some of her friends in real life that only know her by her male avatar, it kind of develops some spicy love triangles and romance in the real world that wouldn't have been as possible if she was just a girl right from the start in the game. And I think One Half Prince is really fun just because a lot of the story is just a fun video game. It's just the main character kind of exploring this video game, just kind of doing the quest lines as she wants and seeing how this world works. Later on, it does kind of take a turn. It becomes a different kind of a story, but I still think it's definitely worth checking out. A story that conveys the feelings of a long-distance relationship. Yeah, so the story that I have for you for this, I actually think really epitomizes the idea of long distance and long distance relationship. And that manga is Voices of a Distant Star. This manga is super short, only having about 10 chapters, and is actually adapted from an even shorter 25-minute short film from Makoto Shinkai, who you might know as a director of Your Name. Yeah, and this really short 10-chapter manga really resonated with me. I thought it was a really beautiful story that really showed off some of the troubles that come with being in a long-distance relationship. Voices of Distant Star follows a couple who kind of have a crush on each other in middle school, but out of nowhere, one of them is drafted into kind of this space exploration mission, as she's been recruited by the United Nations to help survey the existence of a new alien race that was discovered. But on the other hand, the boy in this relationship is stuck on Earth just living his normal life. But as the girl goes off into space, they're able to still communicate with each other through text. But as the texts are being sent through space, there's a delay in communication. And what starts off as probably only a few hour or a few day delay at the start of the story, but as the girl flies further and further away from Earth, the delay between those texts gets even longer, becoming weeks, months, and even years. And throughout the story, we kind of see these two characters grow up and see what it's like to live life without the other one. Both of them are kind of going through the motions of feeling like they're missing out on what the other person is experiencing, wishing that they could just be with that person, wondering if they should even move on with their lives and what that means for them. Overall, I thought this was just a really beautiful story, and I think the manga actually has a different ending than the movie, and I think the manga ending is really good. A main character with a secret monster transformation. Alright, so the manga that I'm about to talk about is something that I've actually already made a video for, so you can check it out over here. But this manga is Choujin X, which is actually by the same author as Tokyo Ghoul. And I think in a lot of ways, if you were a Tokyo Ghoul fan, then you'll probably be a Choujin X fan. Choujin X is set in a world where some people do have something similar to quirks, but in this world, those superpowered people are actually shunned by society and are just seen as terrorists or generally just threats to society. One day, our main character is given a drug that suddenly turns him into one of these superpowered people called Choujins. And as he gets his power, he's transformed into this big kind of bird monster, something that is extremely hard for him to hide from his family or friends at school. But even though he just wants to live a normal life away from all this Choujin nonsense, that doesn't stop him from being inevitably pulled into that world. I think with Choujin X, the author Sui Ishida has really great storytelling. I think the world building and the powers are both really cool, and it's definitely the kind of story that just keeps getting deeper and darker the more it gets into it. I mean, how many stories are there where the main villain of the world is just a B-52 stealth bomber with arms? And you know, I don't really like to be one of those guys who's just like, oh man, just wait for this arc to finish and then the manga will get so good. Just wait, guys. But really, with Choujin X, I think it starts off good, but as soon as you finish the baseball arc, it just gets amazing. Especially when you figure out what the X in Choujin X means. A manga with extreme edginess. Okay, for all the edgelords out there, I got you. The recommendation I have for you that is probably one of the edgiest manga I've ever read is called Dungeon Seeker. This manga is honestly like all edge and not really too much plot. This is an isekai story where the main character, his crush, and a few of his bullies are all isekai'd into another world and given some random powers. But the main character and his crush get kind of trash powers and live together in poverty for a few years in this new world. Whereas the bullies, of course, got some nice powers and lived a pretty good life in this new world. Well, the life of the main character changes when one day, his crush teams up with the bullies and betrays him so that she can join them and live a good life for herself too. He's kind of given a death sentence by being thrust into a really dangerous dungeon that he's not supposed to be able to escape from. But little does everyone else know that his power is actually to absorb the ability of anything he kills. And so, as he goes through this dungeon and kills more and more monsters, he just kind of lives up to this insane power fantasy. But as the story goes, events keep happening that break his mental more and more, and by doing so, the edginess just keeps growing. There's a lot of violence and blood in this one, so if you're into that and you really want the edge, here you go. A manga that starts after the Demon Lord is defeated. After the immense popularity of Freerun, I'm sure a lot of people are looking for a manga that fills the kind of niche that Freerun was filling. And while I wouldn't say the manga I'm about to bring up is anything similar to Freerun at all, it does start after the Demon Lord is completed and does have a kind of interesting concept to it. This manga is Tsuyokute New Saga. And like I was saying, starts when the MC and his party defeat the Demon Lord, but by the end of the fight, only the main character is still alive. Suddenly, right after the fight, an energy envelops him, and he wakes up as himself from 10 years ago, before the war with the Demon Lord even started. And the premise of this manga is that now that the main character has knowledge of all of the events that are happening over the next decade, he's on a mission to optimize his fight with the Demon Lord by minimizing the amount of casualties that are lost along the way. He knows exactly where all the secret treasures are, he knows exactly all the important people to talk to, he knows the assassinations that are going to happen politically. But what he quickly finds out is that there is a butterfly effect in changing the past, and he'll have to deal with that too. A manga with a strong bromance. So this manga, Kyō Kara Ore Wa, it was airing in the 80s and 90s, but it definitely still holds up today and is so hilarious. This is a delinquent comedy manga that is really about two delinquents that have very different missions in life. They're both extremely strong at fighting, but one of them uses his powers more as a defender of the weak, whereas the other one wants to prove that he's the strongest delinquent in Japan. And the story just kind of aimlessly follows the different troublesome situations they get themselves into. This manga is absolutely hilarious. I was cracking up chapter after chapter, but the author does an amazing job at just suddenly transitioning to something serious and badass out of nowhere, and it just feels so right. The two main characters of Kyō Kara Ore Wa are iconic and extremely memorable. There's a reason that this manga is in the top 75 best-selling manga of all time. A manga that breaks the fourth wall. Alright, I'll raise you one even better for this. How about a manga where the entire concept is that it breaks the fourth wall? This is actually a manhwa called July Found by Chance. The main character of this story is just a typical girl living her typical high school life until she suddenly finds out that she's actually a character in a comic book that's currently being written. But the kicker is that she's not even the main character. She's just a random extra that was honestly written to be put through a lot of heartbreak and was even given a terminal illness. But the main character refuses to buy into her written destiny and is absolutely out to do things her own way. And in the setting of this manga, we're told it is a head and tails version of the comic that's being written in this story. The heads version is canonically whatever happens in the comic. Whenever the authors put the main character into any scene, she must canonically do whatever they write for her. If they have her saying a certain line, she must say that without fail to whoever is around. However, any panel that she's not in is up to her to do whatever she wants to, and especially as an extra, she's not regularly in the Heads universe. So she's out to change her destiny, and little by little, the changes that she makes within the Tails universe end up making changes within the actual Heads universe too. It's a big back and forth between the authors and what the main character wants, and it was a cool take on a romance story. A manga like Tokyo Ghoul. Alright, I know that I mentioned Choujin X earlier in the video, and that's literally written by the same author as Tokyo Ghoul, but nah man, that's not the one I'm about to talk about. The one I'm about to talk about is Rosario Vampire. Now hold up, I know you're probably calling me crazy for comparing Tokyo Ghoul to Rosario Vampire, but I just want you to know that when I came up with this idea, I tried to Google it to see if anyone else had made the comparison, and I actually found this whole blog post comparing tons of different parts between Tokyo Ghoul and Rosario Vampire. So guys, I might actually be onto something here, so hear me out. Rosario Vampire starts off as a rom-com of just this human kid who accidentally transfers to a high school full of only monsters. And as the only human, he must hide this so that he can actually survive in this school. But the key thing here is that kind of similar to Tokyo Ghoul, Rosario Vampire is split into 2 parts. And part 2 is where Rosario Vampire goes from good to great. I mean, just look at the My Anime List reviews. You can kind of see that part 2 is scored way higher than part 1. This story definitely amps up in intensity, and I promise, it really gives off similar vibes to Tokyo Ghoul. So if you've been kind of avoiding Rosario Vampire, especially because I've heard the anime adaptation is terrible, give the manga a chance. And I'll link to the blog post in the description. A manga like Attack on Titan. So with Attack on Titan, I think of vibes of humanity trying to fight off against a foe that's greater than humanity itself. And the recommendation I have for you is After God, which is something I also talked about in this video here. In After God, humanity is terrorized by beings that are just simply called gods. These gods appear to be unbeatable and are eager to kill humans whenever they want to. But unlike the Titans in Attack on Titan, these gods are sentient and know what they're doing, and they're able to talk to humans and kind of convert them to their side whenever they need to. The main character of this story works for an anti-god organization, and one day stumbles across a girl who's out to kill the gods. The main character thinks she's kind of crazy and reckless, but out of nowhere, she shows off that she has the exact same powers as the gods. And suddenly, just like Attack on Titan, humanity finally has a chance of beating these gods by fighting fire with fire. This is a really cool story with great art, and I think it has a lot of really unique concepts. I mean, this is the only story I've read where I've actually gotten emotionally invested in a drug-addicted bunny. A manga where the main character has amnesia. So amnesia as a plot device is always interesting and is usually not something the main character starts with. But when I was trying to find something good to read, I first came across Ichinose family's Deadly Sins, which honestly I didn't think was that great. As I kept digging, I finally found No Guns Life, which I thought was pretty cool. If you're familiar with Dorohedoro, No Guns Life kind of has a similar main character, who is someone who was once a normal human, but was transformed into a completely different being and has amnesia from before they were transformed. But instead of the reptile head like in Dorohedoro, No Guns Life is about a main character whose head is literally transformed into a gun. But the funny part is, he can't actually fire his own gun because it's way behind his head. He needs somebody else to fire it for him, but he's someone who's completely untrustworthy of others. So part of the story is him trying to trust and slowly open up to others. And No Guns Life is definitely a cyberpunk story, kind of similar to Dimension W that I mentioned earlier, but unlike Dimension W, this is really more similar to Blade Runner. It's dark and gritty, and really much more of the mature parts of a cyberpunk setting. The main character of the story works as a detective, and the storytelling itself is kind of slow-paced, but it really makes for this well-rounded noir cyberpunk story. Okay guys, that's all the recommendations I have for you, and if you want another video like this, let me know below what other suggestions you might have in mind that you want me to answer for you. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.